Ugh, I really didn't want to make this video, but after my third attempt at making a script about the themes of Made in Abyss, I realized I couldn't avoid talking about this. But why, you may be asking? Why do I have to drag this totally unrelated can of worms into a video analysis? Well, you see, in my attempts to explain the Abyss's thematic role in the context of the Made in Abyss universe, I realized that we first needed to understand Akihito Tsukushi's intentions when creating this world. And whether you like it or not, all this disturbing imagery is actually a pretty important element to understanding the story. Well, at least some of it. Before I give my honest opinion behind Tsukushi's choice to include this imagery, I have to explain why it's in the story from a thematic point of view. When I asked myself the question, what does the Abyss represent in the scope of the Made in Abyss universe, I began to look for clues in the world building and came up with some very bare bones observations. For starters, it's evident that the Abyss is not only a source of power for Orth, but also several nations. In addition to that, life in Orth, both physically and figuratively, revolves around the Abyss. And finally, Delvers, more specifically White Whistles, are among the most respected and loved members of this fictional society. Though not groundbreaking or difficult to deduce, based on these three observations, we can see Tsukushi intended for the reader or the viewer to understand that in one way or another, the Abyss represented power. Except, he did and he didn't. Because if there's one thing we need to understand about Tsukushi, is that everything he does is inherently dualistic. From juxtaposing the cute and the horrific, to juxtaposing the innocent with the vile, we simply cannot take Tsukushi's depictions at face value. And though there is not much information regarding Tsukushi's personal life, aside from a handful of unofficially translated interviews, we do have a few comments regarding Tsukushi's philosophy when creating the series. During a 2018 promotional interview, when asked about the series' brutality following its lighthearted beginning, Tsukushi stated, "Only in darkness can life bloom as a bright light. No matter how dim the light is, it must be blinding in vast darkness." Later adding that Riko was akin to an Abyss Otaku, or an Abyss Baka, for pushing herself through perilous situations in order to obtain happiness by achieving what no one else had achieved. Based on this response, we can assume that to Riko, and extension the majority of Delvers, the Abyss represents passion. And since passion is linked to suffering, not to mention the fact that the word literally means to suffer, we can see how Tsukushi's use of darkness is his means of portraying the strength of Riko's love for exploration. During the same interview, Tsukushi even likened Delvers to famous mountaineer Aaron Ralston, who continued to climb mountains even after severing his arm in order to free himself from a boulder. This admission adds credence to the fact that Tsukushi's thematic goals were to create a sense of gruesome adversity in order to convey greater triumphs for his characters. But remember how I said that the Made in Abyss setting intrinsically leads us to associate the Abyss with power? Let's talk about that. In the same way the Abyss evokes Riko's passion for exploration, it also evokes desire for those who stay on the surface. The nation of Beluska is shown to profit so much from the Abyss, they created an accreditation system in the form of whistles to prevent people from taking valuable relics for themselves. Which, as we know, was not enough to stop Bondrewd from doing that, but alas, this link to power remains valid, just not for the main characters, but rather for the story's setting. This means that though Tsukushi wanted the Abyss to symbolize passion for Riko, he wanted her to live in a world where it represented power. This reality regarding the Made in Abyss universe is the reason for its depictions of unethical treatment towards children. If we look at Belchero Orphanage, for example, we see that the organization does not focus on getting children adopted, but instead exploits them in order to raise money for its operational costs. Though Belchero initially invests in education of new orphans, this education is shown to only focus on delving in order to force its orphan population into unpaid labor. And though some orphans grow up to be instructors, it's highly likely many are pigeonholed into an unwanted delving career. Tsukushi's use of perceived normalcy, then, indicates that Orth as a society has an apathetic view of children, with the orphans themselves assuming their roles as slaves without questioning society's merits. In essence, Made in Abyss is a commentary on how dysfunctional societies cope with their horrible circumstances through recreation. Similar to how Roman poet Decimus Junius Juvenalis described Rome's societal stability as relying on bread and circuses, Orth relies on bread and the Abyss. So now that we've established Orth's inherent degeneracy and corruption at the hands of the Abyss, we must now talk about a regrettable inclusion into this story. It was during my attempts at describing the role of innocence when I realized that I could not ignore Tsukushi's sexually suggestive images of children. Before I give my opinion about this bizarre choice, I do have to explain what it's trying to convey, at least superficially. Given that Tsukushi's work heavily relies on subversion and shock value in order to convey the gravity of a situation, Tsukushi chose to include an additional avenue to signal the destruction of childhood innocence within Maiden Abyss's universe. In Chapter 1, when we see a flashback of Riko being tied up and beaten while naked, we are told via subtext that Orth's culture has a complete disregard for a child's innocence, finding it acceptable to humiliate them in order to dissuade dissidents. We are then shown at the end of Volume 2 an image of Marulk also suffering from the same punishment, thus adding to the idea that the Maiden Abyss universe views children as objects that require violent recalibration when faulty. When it came to Vueko's depictions of rape and torture at the hands of her caretaker, however, Tsukushi used irony to depict the tragedy of the Ganjacore who escaped depravity to an even more depraved world. This irony adding to the motif that Maiden Abyss characters experience life by coping with their inescapable realities through novelty. Having said all that, had Tsukushi's use of sexual imagery involving children stayed within the context of depicting the brutality and sadism of the Maiden Abyss universe, its use could have been impactful. Unfortunately, Tsukushi did not stick to using this shocking imagery as a means to establish the setting of the series, but rather shoehorned sexualized poses and angles throughout mundane moments, thus leading us to question his motivations. To be charitable, an argument could be made that in addition to visually supporting the adage of Maiden Abyss's hostile attitude towards children, the sexualization of characters such as Riko serves to allude to Reg's sexual tension with female characters of his same purported age. Except, Tsukushi had already been successful in doing this by depicting Reg's sexual arousal to both Riko and Nanachi through the use of comical dialogue. This fact leads me to conclude that the reason Tsukushi chose to sexualize children in a visual medium was simply because he wanted to sexualize children in a visual media. Though it's not anyone's place to make assumptions about Tsukushi's personal life, given that there's no evidence he had done anything illegal or morally wrong towards children, it does leave the audience in a state of apprehension. I, for one, do not believe in the censorship of art no matter how egregious its depictions, given that no one was harmed in its creation. After all, I personally don't believe in victimless crimes. But with that in mind, it does make me worry about the things I don't know about Tsukushi. So though I'm not condemning Tsukushi, nor will I ever condemn Tsukushi's art for existing, I hope I'll never have to condemn Tsukushi himself.